Hello everyone and welcome back to Real History. And I'm your host, History Professor Jared Frederick. And before we get started, we of course remind you to hit those like and subscribe buttons below if you have not already. As you can see, we have a brand new set here at Real History. And I'd like to take this moment, not to only introduce you to our new space, but to also introduce you to our co-host for this episode. That is none other than my brother, Mark. So Mark, please do tell the good people a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing here at Real History.
Thanks, Jared. Well, I've mostly been working behind the scenes, working with our producer, Andy. I've been editing for several months now, going back to our kind of breakdowns of Masters of the Air. But my other work includes being a museum professional, a documentarian, and a public historian. So I kind of hope that my insight as a communications and history major provides a little bit of insight to our breakdown here today.
And in fact, the movie that Mark and I chose for this debut episode of our set is a movie that we have somewhat of a personal connection to, because you and I had aspired to make a film whose storyline was going to overlap to an extent with the one that we've chosen. And that movie is the 1998 war drama from HBO Productions entitled When Trumpets Fade. And our personal connection is that this talks about the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, and our very own grandfather fought in that campaign in November of 1944. You and I have had the opportunity to explore the Hurtgen battlefields fairly in depth with a lot of expert guides. And so we very much hope to impart some of those insights and also some photos from our journey into the conversation as we examine our film. So let's go ahead right now and take a look at When Trumpets Fade.
From a filmmaking perspective, I really like the incorporation of this archival footage of the 28th Infantry Division entering Paris. This is actually a compilation of both Signal Corps footage and film shot by Hollywood director George Stevens.
Yeah. He made The Diary of Anne Frank after the war.
Yes. And I think the visuals here speak to that sort of optimistic spirit the Allies had in late summer 1944. And of course, that optimism is going to wane over the following months. Likewise, this triumphant version of warfare pictured here is quickly going to disappear as the movie progresses. I like that sense of stark contrast, both historically and cinematically.
So I got some really great insight on this movie through a 1998 interview that I discovered with screenwriter Bill Vogt, who actually had given up his job as a training video producer in Wisconsin. So I presume he was making like worker safety training videos or something like that. But he spent 4 years writing this movie and spent a lot of that time trying to get this discovered. And according to him, in this interview with his hometown newspaper in Wisconsin, the script for this movie was found by none other than Steven Spielberg's team. And this script was in the running to be the World War II film that Steven Spielberg hoped to shoot in 1997. But rather, it was skipped by major studios, and instead Spielberg directed
Saving Private Ryan.
Saving Private Ryan. So
cool.
He got so close to having his first big project picked up by Spielberg. But in any case, you have these three movies, a trifecta of World War II films, When Trumpets Fade, Saving Private Ryan, and The Thin Red Line, all come out in the year 1998. And to one extent or another, those movies are going to have a profound impact on reigniting public interest in the Second World War.
Indeed.
I'm gonna make it.
You're gonna make it.
My lucky day.
It's a lucky day.
I got the luck.
You got it, Bobby.
To set the stage, I think it's helpful to think of the Hurtgen Forest as really nothing less than this conveyor belt of death. Veterans referred to it as green hell or the death factory, and for very good reason. You've been there, you can connect the dots. But for nearly half a year, it was one American division after another thrown in pell-mell with the hope that they would be able to overcome the odds by sheer number and force of will. And ultimately, this was going to become the longest battle in U.S. Army history, and quite possibly also the most futile battle ever fought in U.S. Army history. So there's some grim stuff ahead. Might be worthwhile to give some additional background to some of our viewers that might be less familiar with the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. So this begins in September of 1944 when the 9th Infantry Division was among the first U.S. units to enter this revolving door of death, for the lack of a better phrase. And man, they just sustained really heavy casualties, and they encounter what will become some of the universal perils of the Hurtgen Forest. And that's these tall, towering pine and fir trees. They explode. There's mines left behind. The Germans had years to plan the defenses in this sector, and they are going to put their knowledge and expertise of the terrain to very lethal and effective use as the campaign is going on here. But by late October, the 28th Infantry Division, an old Pennsylvania National Guard unit, which you and I still have some friends serving in to this very day, was brought up on this part of the line and started to get into the thick of combat by early November of 1944. And so as we see here, that's where our story begins, at a scene which I think has some really great set dressing that captures the desolation and the carnage. We see a smoking skeleton there. We see corpses in the foreground. I mean, it looks apocalyptic, and I think this shot does a really good job of setting the scene.
In a 1998 interview, actor Ron Eldard noted that they filmed this on an old Soviet training area outside of Budapest in November 1997.
That doesn't surprise me.
And prior to filming, the actors spent a week in a boot camp with the United States Marine Corps.
Instead of the Army.
Instead of the Army.
That's interesting.
But despite not having a massive budget, he said that this exercise really paid off for the actors in the long term by dealing with the elements, isolation, dreariness of the landscape. He said that it really helped the cast connect with their characters more.
I can imagine.
Another fun side note of this is that one of our good friends who is a veteran of the more modern 28th Division said some of his officers were consultants on the movie.
That doesn't surprise me, because this is a very hallowed, almost sacred moment for people's conceptions of the 28th Infantry Division, especially those who were and are in the unit. So I'm not surprised that they might have had some unit historians on scene to
absolutely
help set some things up.
We're getting replacements in from the channel. Tonight you'll be fitted with a new squad. Congratulations, Private. You're a sergeant now.
In my mind, there's a lot of truth behind this idea of sudden replacements and rapid promotions. There was this quickly revolving door of men just like these coming and going in these divisions that entered the Hurtgen Forest. And one story that particularly comes to mind is the story of George Wilson, who decades later wrote the combat memoir If You Survive, which I think is one of the best combat memoirs of the Second World War. And this was a guy who showed up as a replacement officer in Normandy, and his commanding officer told him that if he survived this first week, hence the title, if he survived this first week, that he would be promoted to captain. And the poor guy, that never happened. He never was promoted to captain. He goes through Normandy, fights through France. He ends up here in the Hurtgen Forest, and because of the horrible casualty rates, he ends up commanding an entire company as a lieutenant. And throughout the war, and this is very emblematic of the Hurtgen Forest, I mean, his division suffers 250% casualties throughout the conflict. And so these attrition rates were just staggering. And I think we get a sense of that in this film as well.
How'd you manage to get out, Manning? Did you get cut off from the rest of the platoon?
War movie buffs might actually recognize actor Dylan Bruno here, who played one of Matt Damon's paratrooper comrades in Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
If you recall, he had enough Composition B to blow the bridge at Rommel, not once, but twice. So this was a big year for Bruno, being in 2 of those 3 notable World War II films of 1998. But I think we can acknowledge that his characters don't have much luck defending bridges in these movies.
It's true.
You want to light up a cigarette at night? Lay on your back at the bottom of the hole.
I don't smoke.
Huh?
I don't smoke.
As I rewatched this film, I noticed a lot of similarities between this movie and director John Irvin's previous war film, which is entitled Hamburger Hill. Have you ever seen
I have not.
Hamburger Hill? We'll have to
not.
check it out here on the channel sometime.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
that earlier movie is set in Vietnam in 1969, but there's a lot of themes that carry over in my mind, as you might suspect, because you have this squad with people from all walk of life, and they're thrown into a mission that seems useless, and one by one they begin to crack. And what resonates most in these 2 movies really are the notions of futility and pointlessness. And both of them are muddy, they're both dark, they're both cynical. That's the perfect representation of the themes of the Hurtgen Forest in my mind. And, I once read that Irvin also planned to make a movie about the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy, which was its own exercise in futility in a lot of different ways.
Sure.
And so that movie would have followed the same trend of these 2 earlier ones, but sadly the movie never came to fruition. And so he's up there in years now. I don't know if...
Yeah, it's probably pretty doubtful.
Yeah, unfortunately.
This evil-looking German officer with the black leather jacket and the scar across his face, I feel is just very much a trope that we find in World War II movies. I think a more compelling visual would have been to depict maybe a squad of German soldiers that look just as scared and just as uncertain as the Americans that they're looking for. But if you truly want a war movie to be an anti-war movie, there has to be a certain degree of empathy evoked for the soldiers of both sides. Naturally, this doesn't make their causes equal or morally comparable, but the conditions of Hurtgen didn't discriminate depending on what uniform you were wearing. That's such a great shot of Warren in the fog. But speaking of stereotypes, in this assortment of GIs, we see the same narrative formula that we see in so many war movies. You have the pudgy and nerdy replacement. You have the bitter and mysterious sergeant.
The mysterious sergeant, yeah.
You have the cocky or comical private who has a rude wake-up call. It always seems like there's someone from Brooklyn. In any case, there's a great bit of dialogue here where Warren says that being alone in the fog made him feel like he was drowning. And I just think that is a perfect way to sum up the physical and emotional isolation that these guys were feeling. Now, while we're discussing fog, the crew actually recreated these conditions by burning tires off camera. Must not have been an EPA there at the time, but it certainly created this kind of dark and smoky setting. But I truly hope that no one got sick afterwards.
Yeah, that's not the sort of fog of war you want to be inhaling.
Yeah,
Ugh.
indeed.
To get there, we have got to secure the river crossing on the Call Trail. Now we'll approach the river through this part of the forest.
Okay, first of all, this is a horrible looking and completely ahistorical map that they're looking at here. I mean, it looks like a strategy board game from the 1960s. It's probably oversimplified for the sake of the audience, but it also kind of trivializes the complexities and difficulties that a lot of these troops were encountering over this very rugged terrain. In reality, what the Call Trail was, and you've hiked the Call Trail,
Indeed.
it was a glorified goat path.
Mm-hmm.
It did not offer the sort of infrastructure that these U.S. soldiers needed to get up the mountains. And you have the 112th Infantry Regiment, who is, shoved down the throat of this little trail that it can't accommodate. This is a regiment that didn't have any support from any of its sister units. And to make things worse, well, you've seen, or at least a modern recreation or rebuilding of it. There's this very small stone bridge that spans across the Call River, and when American troops arrive there, they're not even sure if their tanks can fit across it.
Yeah,
because
barely.
it's so small. And there certainly weren't any Bailey bridges here, as was discussed. My guess is that the Army in Hungary probably had Bailey bridges, and they're like, here, film production, you can use this Bailey bridge if you want to throw it in the scene. But when some Sherman tanks and tank destroyers headed across that bridge on November 5th, almost all of them were annihilated within days. So here we are, another act of futility. And is it on this stretch where there's still some rubber tank treads that were burned into the ground that can still be? Is this the part?
Yeah, that is the correct pathway.
Yeah.
It was barely wide enough to get Shermans up through, so it created quite a problem for these tankers trying to relieve infantry.
What are you thinking, putting a replacement at Point on his first patrol?
I've got nothing but replacements.
You should have stayed at Point, Sergeant.
Overall, I think this is a very effective performance on the part of Timothy Oliphant, who would, of course, reach fame just a few years later on this very same channel with HBO's Deadwood, the classic Western TV show. But the conversation that we see here leads to all sorts of questions, and it either highlights some cinematic traits or some historical flaws in the film. I'm not sure which one, though. For instance, is this lieutenant experienced, or is he green?
Yeah.
Would he have been so concerned about the positioning of replacements, since pretty much everybody was a replacement as far as enlisted men were concerned? Or is this meant to show the disconnect between leadership and frontline soldiers? I don't know.
Good point.
Most importantly, this lieutenant would not be hunkered down inside of a bunker. Lieutenants were in drastically short supply on the front in the Hurtgen. And this guy would have been out in the field, in reality, possibly commanding a company like George Wilson was, or at the very least, be running a platoon. So this high concentration of brass inside the CP, probably a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
You find yourself out there in the middle of a firefight with your guts hanging out? If I can help you in any way without endangering my own life, I won't hesitate.
I feel that we often associate brutality and ruthlessness when discussing combat in the Hurtgen, but there were a few compassionate moments when soldiers on both sides tried to save their enemy. When the 28th Division fell back to Vosenac, a German surgeon actually organized a brief ceasefire at the Call Bridge.
I've seen a painting of that.
Yes, but it was all in the effort to both evacuate German and American wounded. But by depicting heartfelt moments like that, instead of these ridiculous stereotypes, I feel this movie would have been a lot better. But as you've said, I have walked this landscape, and boy, it's incredibly unforgiving terrain to hike, let alone fight on. But today, there actually is a monument dedicated to those German and American medics who work together to save lives.
It's a dramatic moment for sure. What we see here, I think, is a pretty good depiction of what dragon's teeth looked like along the Siegfried line, although I don't recall actually seeing any in this exact position or vicinity when we were exploring. But from a cinematic standpoint, I think this recreation works well enough, because when you look at it through an artistic lens, these guys are marching into the jaws of death, and so that idea of the dragon's teeth takes on a more symbolic standpoint when you look at it in that way. But visually, this looks like something reminiscent of a World War I movie instead. I mean, you have whistles blowing, they're going into no man's land, they're in massed formations. GIs in World War II did not bunch up like this by the hundreds. They would have been sitting ducks, as we are going to see here in the subsequent scenes. The Hurtgen Forest was synonymous with exploding trees like this, and frankly, I don't think we see enough exploding trees in this movie. You look at some of the photographs of the landscape in the weeks and months afterward, some of these trees look like shaved off toothpicks, or it looks like a bunch of kids just knocked down a bunch of Lincoln logs in the area. So this was just devastating stuff. The forest had been bracketed by the Germans in the months and years prior to this. There were mines known as bouncing betties that would shoot up into the air and castrate soldiers as they were marching through. It was just an incredibly hellish place. And speaking to this, one of the things that we had the opportunity to bring back from the Hurtgen Forest is none other than this bit of shrapnel. And so this is, it might be part of like a German 88 shell or something like that. But even 80 years onward, it is still sharp around the edges. And I can't imagine what this would do. I can't imagine what it would do. I've heard plenty of accounts of it, but flying through the air at 1,000 feet per second and pondering what it could do to the human body is truly a frightening proposition. And this stuff is just everywhere. When we were marching down the road, you're practically kicking up the stuff. So the grim, tangible bits of evidence of the battle are still very much present in this ominous borderland.
Yeah, I don't think that those mines would cause Michael Bay fireballs though.
Yeah,
so that might be a little off there.
It is
as
a
well.
war movie. What do you expect?
You take out those guns, and I'll get you that Section 8 you were begging for.
An officer would never say this. This would set a horrible example and a very bad precedent to the entire company. And even though he might be ensuring efficiency for a very brief moment, in the process, this captain would be sacrificing nothing less than his respect and authority as an officer. So, pure fabrication.
I gotta say that this is a great shot of the captain peering out of the bunker. In reality, though, this is a heavily wooded area, and it's not a large open space like what we see here. This was probably done for the sake of showing the audience just the chaotic scope of the battlefield, perhaps. But I feel that it also diminishes that sort of dark and claustrophobic atmosphere of the Hurtgen Forest. So I personally wish that they had leaned into the horror genre in this movie more. But these are the difficult artistic choices directors have to make when making a film.
I can't think of a single moment where something like this actually happened. Yet non-coms might have shot at a guy who was running away, but not with a rare, valuable flamethrower on his back. And that would not only destroy this valuable piece of property, but it would also put you at risk. It would put your squad at risk. You don't want to be near one of those things when it blows up. This simply would not have happened. And with this, I think we reach perhaps a point of no return in the movie where this really kind of derails both cinematically and historically.
Yeah, agreed.
According to an interview with the screenwriter, these Hungarian tanks were actually cosmetically modified to appear more like German tanks.
Makes sense.
German armor is not my expertise, but they look somewhat presentable. Thing I really like about these scenes is the sound. I think the sound design is pretty good in this movie. There's this sort of concussion and echo that we hear with the guns that I haven't really heard the extent of in other war movies, so I give top marks for that. But I'm supposing this is supposed to represent the November 8th counterattack undertaken by the 116th Panzer Division that effectively booted the 28th out of Schmidt and off the Call Trail. This was an incredibly tragic moment where the men of the 28th lived up to their nickname that was known as the Bloody Bucket. That was a hard-earned title at the Hurtgen Forest because the division suffered something like over 6,000 casualties in a week's time.
Wow.
Get him out of here! God damn it!
Once again, I think Timothy Olyphant delivers here. This is a very accurate representation of a junior officer reaching the breaking point and fueling his hatred of authority figures like Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Yoakam here, who I'm disappointed is not strumming a guitar somewhere in this movie. But there are people like him are seemingly far removed from the realities of sending men into combat. It's almost like there's a lapse of responsibility and a huge disconnect in that regard.
Yeah, that aspect is certainly pretty accurate.
Even though a lot of this rogue mission stuff is quite ridiculous, I think one effective thing shown here, nonetheless, is the danger of barbed wire and concertina wire. You and I have explored a particularly infamous hillside outside of Scheffenhütte, where troops of the 4th Infantry Division became bogged down. And there's, of course, a notable Medal of Honor recipient by the name of Bernard Ray, who blows himself up in the effort to break up this logjam through the concertina wire. A hometown hero of ours, a guy by the name of King Bailey, likewise dies on this very hillside. In fact, our friends over at Snafu Docs have done like a really good 12 or 13 minute documentary taking you step by step through the fighting on that hillside as it lines up with period photographs and footage. If you want to see a really great video, we definitely encourage you to check that out. But in any regard, if nothing else, this scene shows us the lethality of small unit combat, especially when there are obstacles in the way.
Less than a mile, we got less than a mile.
It's too far.
It's not too far.
Despite the movie's flaws, I think this is such a powerful ending. It underscores the theme of repetition that just defined this battle. This went on for 5 months, becoming the longest and one of the most pointless battles in U.S. Army history. This snowy ending, I think, also foreshadows the heavy fighting still to come. The famous Battle of the Bulge occurs soon after, overshadowing Hurtgen both in history, cinema, and other forms of media as well. I think that is why most people have never heard of it, unfortunately. But also we sometimes prefer to celebrate our more victorious past rather than recognizing our mistakes.
You don't say.
Yeah, so even though this movie has plenty of weaknesses, inaccuracies, and tropes, I do give it a lot of credit for going against that grain and raising some awareness.
And that's actually a good segue for some of my final thoughts, because you and I attempted to make a short film about our grandfather's experiences in the Hurtgen Forest, and the pandemic and other logistical challenges associated with that prevented us from achieving that aim. But it's my sincere hope that as this channel grows, we can someday delve into short historical films and more original content like that in the future. So that's one thing that we hope to do and achieve, but until we reach those numbers and that degree that we need to, we're going to be doing a lot more film breakdowns and making use of this brand new set that we have. But it also makes me think about one of the chief ambitions of director John Irvin as he was making this film, because even though it does fall prey to some of the tropes, he really wanted to create a unique war film that, like you said, went against the grain. And this is what he had to say on the matter. I want people to look at World War II as they do the Vietnam War. It was a war of attrition. The casualty rate was high, and thousands of men lost their lives. They call it the good war, but there's no such thing if you're in it. So I think those are some pretty profound thoughts, and I think despite the shortcomings of this film, that it succeeds in regard to the director's intentions. Now, you and I have friends and historians in Germany who live in the Hurtgen Forest. They do not have high opinions of this film. They pretty much believe that it serves no purpose, that it conflates and it trivializes the history of the battle, and I respect their opinions on that. But one of our other expert friends, a guide who has shown us around, a good friend by the name of Gerard, has a more compromising view, and he's of the hope that it potentially serves as a gateway for people finding out more about the Hurtgen Forest. And there's simply just not a lot of movies or documentaries or books on the matter. But in any regard, as we think about this trifecta of World War II films that I mentioned earlier, Saving Private Ryan, When Trumpets Fade, and The Thin Red Line, they're all about World War II, but there's another common thread amongst them as well, and that is the fact that they all have to do with the meaning of life. In Saving Private Ryan, life does in fact have meaning. We're going to send one squad to go find one missing paratrooper, which never historically would have happened, by the way. But in any case, life has meaning. We're going to go get this guy and take him home to his family. In The Thin Red Line, at the end of the movie, we have this one tropical tree popping up out of the beach, suggesting that life goes on, that in the broad scope of time, this war and everybody who fights it, it's just like a speck of sand in an hourglass. Life goes on. In When Trumpets Fade, though, life is meaningless. It's expendable. It can be wasted at will for no apparent purpose. And in that regard, in a strange sort of way, this movie is the bravest of the three of those World War II movies, because, as you said, it goes against the grain. And I think, at least in that respect, this movie deserves a little bit of our attention and admiration. I'd like to hear more about your thoughts about these interpretations in the comments section below. Before we wrap up, as always, we have some recommended reading, and a book that I mentioned earlier is called If You Survive. And this is the memoirs of Lieutenant George Wilson, who was in the 4th Infantry Division. And a core element of this book explores his experiences in the Hurtgen Forest. And if you really want to get a sense of the uncertainty and the attrition and the dangers and the horrible way that Mother Nature was in the Hurtgen Forest, this is a really good choice as far as reading goes. And another good memoir, this one is a classic. I have a 1960s edition right here, and that is Road to Hurtgen by Paul Bosch, who was an officer in the 8th Infantry Division. And this is a guy who pulls no punches in this very vivid firsthand account of the Hurtgen. And Mark has a very suitable memoir as well. Mark, tell us a little bit about this one.
This book is called Bloody Roads to Germany by William Meller, and he was in the 28th Infantry Division during Hurtgen. And I personally just love this book because just the way he writes things, it's practically a movie script already. Like the dialogue and everything that's in it, it's essentially written as if it's a journal almost. And so I just love the dialogue and the writing in this book. It provides fantastic insight into how desperate these men were during the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest.
Check them out. Before we head out, just a quick reminder to subscribe, like, and comment below. As we said, every bit always helps. We thank you for tuning in, and we thank you, Mark, for some of your guest commentary and also designing and building this beautiful set that will serve us well for many episodes of Real History to come. So, much appreciated.
Thanks for having me. It's been my pleasure.
All right. So, until we see you next time on Real History, stay curious.